Hello, we are ready for chapter 17 of The Treasure Hunter's Tale. Unbeknownst to the developments, our three treasure hunters, Mr. Saved by Grace, Mr. Newhart, and Mr. Discover the Truth, were still hastening their way to the county unreached. As the officer had warned them, they had had to traverse many miles, and the road, although straight and narrow, had taken them through many challenges. One particular challenge was a large arid desert called Leviticus. The men, who had been travelling for some time, looked at each other in despair when they saw the miles of burning sand and little else. But the road they were to travel clearly went through the desert, so through this desert the men must go. Before entering, they made sure they had plenty of water in the bottles and waved little hats from palm branches to protect them from the burning heat. As they started into the desert, they saw a whirling cloud of dust and sand in the distance and heard distant roaring and moaning and then suddenly silence. Each man nerved himself and gripped onto his sword, ready to face whatever might come upon them. The dust cloud drew nearer. "Well, if it isn't my old friends and brothers," said a manful voice in a friendly tone. Mr. Discover the Truth shielded his eyes from the sun and peered into the dust cloud. He could just make out the silhouette of a man. "Stand forth and be recognised," he called into the cloud, for it is better to be wary even of a friendly tone, as the evil one himself can disguise himself as an angel of light. A man stepped out of the cloud. "Well met, gentlemen." It was young Mr. Set Free. He was covered in scratches and blood, but seemed to be cheerful enough. "Whatever have you been up to?" queried Mr. Saved by Grace. He offered Mr. Set Free his water bottle, and the young man took it gratefully. "My commission, of course. Just downed a large, aggressive creature up yonder." He motioned to where they had heard the awful roarings. "It gave up a good fight, though," he said, motioning to his blood-stained face and arm. "I believe it was Lusty himself," he said triumphantly. "Good work, man," cheered the hunters. "Good work indeed." "Aye, but there's much more yet to be done, so I must away, gentlemen. Although I wager that that dragon was guarding something precious. Even in this desert you may find treasure." And with that he strode off. The three men looked at each other. "Well, if that's not a rebuke from the king himself," sighed Mr. Newhart. "For I tell you, brothers, I had not the slightest inclination to expect to find anything like treasure in this forsaken place," he confessed. "We too," said his friends. So they walked on with their eyes open and their hearts expectant, asking the king to reveal to them his treasure even in this wasteland. After many miles and mirages, which truly play havoc with one's mind, they stopped for a rest under a wide and prickly brush tree. It afforded them some shade, and they drank from their bottles. "Maybe we should rest here and travel when the sun is not at its highest point," panted Mr. Saved by Grace. "Good idea," agreed the others. Now, as people who live in hot countries know, the ground is always cooler the lower you are, and so the men began to dig down into the sand. It wasn't easy, as really dry sand often just slides back into position, but they persevered, and after much effort they had created a space which definitely felt cooler. When Mr. Discover the Truth was digging, he found, to his great encouragement, that he was anticipating finding some more treasure, and was even surprised when all they found was more sand. The three men settled down as best they could and rested, each sending messages of thanks to the king for keeping them on their journey, and also for the successful slaughter of that old dragon Lusty that Mr. Set Free had battled with for so many years. Once the sun had set and the moon had risen, the men made good their journey. It was certainly easier and cooler travelling by moonlight, and they made good progress. After some hours they came to an area where there had clearly been a battle. There was dried blood and scales, and then a little further, the dead body of the huge beast that Mr. Set Free had slain. "Remember, Mr. Set Free said he thought the beast was guarding something," remarked Mr. Saved by Grace. "Well, let us see if we can't discover what that something is, shall we?" "Indeed," said the other two, putting down their kit bags and getting out their trowels. By the light of the moon they could see pretty well, and so each decided to count their steps from the beast and go off in different directions, but always making sure to walk in a straight line and then return to then walk off at a different angle, for it would not do for them to become separated and lost. After trying several angles, Mr. Discover the Truth came across a pile of bones. At first he shrunk back, which is a natural reaction when you see a pile of bones, but then he thought this might be the dragon's nest, and so, retracing his steps, he waited for his brothers to come back to the meeting point, and then they all went across together. Sure enough, after much excavating, they came to a pile of gold and gems hidden under the bones. Each piece of treasure had a reference to the king's book, and the men eagerly took out their Bibles and started reading. There was a reference to chapter 11, which seems to be at first a confusing collection of verses about what people in those days should and shouldn't eat. It is the kind of verse that one would naturally brush over as ancient history, not really applicable to ourselves, as we know that the Apostle Peter was shown very clearly that no animal was to be called unclean. However, when read through the glasses and with much prayerful wisdom, the real gem of that message is this. In the chapter, it states very clearly that an animal has to be cloven-footed and chew the cud to be clean, but an animal that only does one of these is to be unclean. So basically, we are to read the word and to do it too. It is no good just reading the words in the Bible like one might read a menu or a story, but we have to put those words into practice. It's also no good to do good works without following the words in the Bible. Both have to be done together if we are truly to know God. Another gem had chapter 19, verse 18, which says, "Do not avenge yourselves or bear a grudge, but rather love thy neighbour." And there was a ruby that read, once you looked up the reference, "For it is the blood that makes an atonement for the soul." Now this verse, which is found in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, is talking about the old animal sacrifices that God's people used to have to make a long time ago. But it speaks of better things too, as it was the shedding of the blood of Jesus that paid for the punishment of my sin. There were emeralds and sapphires and nuggets of gold and silver coins, which, if I documented them here, this book would be very heavy indeed. However, you can discover them all for yourself. Just open the Bible and ask God to help you see his treasures. The sun was starting to rise, and so the men left the treasure for others to find and enjoy and went on their way. For while it is good to see treasures others have taken the pains to discover behind glass in a museum, there is something far more exciting to discover some yourself.